Good morning. I'm Bill Lasician. I'm with the Center of Public Policy and Private Enterprise, and I'd like to present the results of our research on unintended outcomes of small business legislation and policy opportunities for improvement. This research was accomplished by myself and two co-authors, the Honorable Jack Scansler, who was the former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and one of our graduate students, Ginny Burge. Shortly after this presentation, we'll have a panel discussion about the results. We'll have Jack Gansler moderating, Andrew P. Hunter from CSIS participating, Stan Salway, the President and CEO of Professional Services Council, and Deepak Hataramani, who's a founder and chairman of Istronics, and they'll be happy to address your questions at that point. We started our study by examining the background of the Small Business Act of 1953, and there are some really underlying objectives in the Act that help to frame what the purpose of this is. And some of those are to increase competition, increase innovation, and help small businesses grow into large businesses and help the nation's industrial base. When we think about small businesses and the small business set-asides, we see that the Small Business Administration sets goals for all the different agencies to try to meet, and there's both a prime contracting goal and a subcontracting goal. You can see the goals here for DoD. Prime contracting goal, a little less than 23%. Subcontracting goal, a little less than 37%. And along with the overall goals, there's some subcategories like hub zone small business, service-disabled veterans, small disadvantaged businesses, and women-owned small businesses. There's been some increased emphasis recently placed on small businesses. One of those factors has been the addition of the small business set-aside goals to all the SES evaluations that have acquisition responsibility. So this puts a tremendous amount of pressure on these SESs to meet their goals so they can be fully qualified on their performance metrics and also be eligible for some bonuses. One of the issues within DoD is that a lot of the major programs are large weapon systems and are not eligible for set-asides, so the small business program tends to get shifted into certain segments. One of those segments is knowledge-based services sector, and so you see that some of those sectors get a lot of small business set-aside activity. And finally, because there's increasing pressure to get government work, and particularly with these IDIQ contracts, companies that aren't selected for these contracts tend to bid protest, and the result is they're often added to these contracts, and that is a complicating factor that you have these increasing number of bid protests. You can see this graphic shows the overall government contracting, prime contracting for the last 8 years, or last 15 years rather, and you can see that the amounts increased dramatically, leveled off through about 2012, and then started to decrease. So as these contracting numbers are decreasing, you can see that there's a lot more competition for existing work within the government contracting community, and also more challenging sometimes to meet the goals. One of the factors that affects all businesses, to include small businesses, is increasing regulation. You can see this graph shows the total number of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations and how they've increased since 1975, currently up to about 184,000 pages. A recent study by UMD and the Small Business Administration estimated the regulatory compliance costs at about $1.8 trillion in 2008. This is approximately 10% of the GDP. GDP is a little less than $18 trillion. One of the tough questions when you start thinking about small business policy is defining what a small business is. So the Small Business Administration goes to great lengths to go through the NAICS code and develop a definition for every specific NAICS code. Here we've got one example set. You can see that the small business definition can either be by dollars or by size, numbers of employees. And some of those can be quite large. So if you look at engineering and life sciences, research and development, they can be as much as 1,500 employees if you're looking at doing R&D for aircraft. Significant number of employees for a small business. One of the reasons there's so much pressure put on this and ways that agencies are evaluated is by these scorecards. This is an example of the latest scorecard available for DoD. You can see that there's several elements of the scorecard. The top element is the prime contracting achievement. That's worth 80% of the total. The subcontracting achievement is only worth 10% of the total. And there's a category that's called plan, progress, success factors, which are qualitative factors about the small business program. That's also worth another 10%. So the overriding factor for meeting your goal is to achieve the prime contracting goal, and that's where most agencies put their emphasis. This chart shows the trends in both the DoD achievement of their small business contracting goals and as well as the goal itself. The red line is the goal, and you can see up until this year we were well short of meeting the goal. This year the goal came down about 1%, to about 21.5%, but the DoD exceeded the goal by over 1%, which is the first time they met or exceeded the goal. So this is attributed in part to including this in the SES evaluations, and also the emphasis placed on the better buying power initiatives that were implemented by Mr. Kendall, the Undersecretary. So based on the research we did, I'd like to summarize our findings. One of the parts of the small business program that works very, very well is the SBIR, SETR program, Small Business Innovative Research. This is a program that looks to invest in or provide grants to small companies that develop new technologies. Based on this program, we've had almost 21,500 companies formed. Over 9% of those firms are female-owned, and about 4.5% are minority-owned. Very successful program. Some of the graduates of this program are Qualcomm and iRobot, which are successful now large businesses, and those created a lot of jobs. The small business agency goals, we tried to determine how those were established, and to the best of our research, we couldn't find any methodology for developing those goals, and no one would even identify if one existed. And so they seem to be arbitrary, although it's not clear, and I think that's an issue because it's not clear if the goal is realistic, can it be achieved, is it too high, is it too low. Small business set-asides can create perverse incentives not to grow. When companies get into a sweet spot with these small business incentives, and if they look at the competitive environment they'd have to face if they graduated, some of these businesses just tend to stay in that sweet spot and continue to benefit themselves from these incentives. And that's not one of the objectives of the program. The objectives of the program is to identify the best businesses, have them grow and graduate and be successful. Setting aside very large awards to small businesses can be counterproductive. When you give a small business a very large award, generally they can't accomplish the work on their own. They have to team with a large business. So what happens is you create one loser, but then you block out all the other small businesses, so you have many, you create one winner and you have many losers. And so the other factor is that when these businesses complete this work, they're automatically now a large business generally, and they can't compete for the follow-on work for that same contract. And so unless they're very, very well prepared and diversified, they're really in a tough place and not necessarily will be successful. One of the parts of the conventional wisdom is all the jobs are created by small businesses, which may be true when we talk about the SBIR and innovative companies. But when we're talking about the knowledge-based services, the government determines the requirements, and they set the requirement, and the companies just compete for that number of jobs. And so you really have a zero-sum game. It doesn't matter if those jobs go to small businesses or large businesses. No new jobs are created. The cost for small businesses, although intuitively it seems like they should be lower, that's not necessarily the case. We've already identified that the regulatory costs, particularly for small businesses, can be higher. Based on the size of the company, they can have reduced buying power, they can have difficulty obtaining finances, and so on. And so the cost for small business may in fact be higher, not lower. Using the wrong NAICS code creates issues because you start awarding contracts to the wrong sets of companies and you reward the wrong companies, which may not in fact be qualified for those contracts under the small business set-aside guidelines. And so particularly when you use the R&D category for aircraft, which can be up to 1,500 employees, you in fact create a situation where that probably should have gone to as a full and open competition, and you're setting it aside. You're helping the agency meet its goal, but in fact you're not helping the right kind of company. And finally, small business set-aside programs, because of the rewards that can be gained by these companies, invite fraud and waste and all different kinds of situations where the companies do inappropriate activities to try to benefit from these set-asides. So based on those findings, we made the following recommendations. One, although the SBIR STTR program is very, very successful, there's still room for improvement. National Academies recently published a study that made several recommendations that include how to encourage more commercialization, how to increase the underrepresented populations that participate and improve contracting and auditing. And so that program works very, very well, but there's still room for improvement. When it comes to setting agency goals, the numeric goals, we believe that some work needs to be done to come up with a clear methodology that helps explain where the goal comes from and why it's reasonable. Consideration should be given to maybe coming up with a single goal that includes both the prime and subcontracting. And at a minimum, we should increase the emphasis on the subcontracting goal, since there's a lot of benefit to small businesses from competing as subs, and they get a lot of valuable experience and learn a lot. Next, we should find a way to encourage the best small businesses to grow. One of the objectives of the program is to grow these small businesses, and what that means is when these businesses graduate, there have to be an opportunity for them to compete full and open, and so in certain sectors, particularly in the engineering services sector, if all those awards are set aside for small businesses, if a business graduates, there's no opportunities for them to grow. Next, we'd like to see improved data gathering and program metrics. We do a really good job of measuring the outputs of the program, how many dollars are contracted out, but we don't really understand the outcomes. Are we achieving the overall objectives of the small business set-aside program, which are to increase innovation, increase competition, grow jobs, and improve the industrial base. One of the lessons I think is clear, and recommendations we would make, is that only use set-asides for acquisitions when small businesses can handle them. Putting a company in a position and giving it an award for that's too large for them, they may not have the appropriate management systems, they may not have the appropriate information systems to manage that contract, and you're not really helping the small business when you do that. The NAICS code thresholds need to be clear and unambiguous. We don't want a situation where agencies are using the wrong NAICS codes because they're either poorly defined or broadly defined, and we want to make sure that the program is assisting those companies that it's intended to, and not others. We'd like to revise and reauthorize the Small Business Competitive Demonstration Program. This was a program initiated in 19 '88 and discontinued in 2010, and there was a program in certain industry sectors that allowed agencies to use full and open competition to see what the impact might be on small businesses. And we think that was a good program to pilot and see, and maybe even expand to other industry sectors to see what the impact on small business of more free and open competition is. And finally, goals must be taken to reduce program abuses. We understand that we don't want to do this in a way that increases the regulatory burden, but clearly we want to help the companies that are intended and not help those that aren't intended. And so it's important to try to reduce those abuses to the maximum extent possible. And now we'd like to continue with our panel discussion, and questions will be answered after the discussion.
I appreciate being associated with the Hill. I spent 17 years there, so that's very true. I'm going to make the assertion that I'm a little bit of a triple threat because I work at a think tank now, so I bring that think tank perspective. I worked for Ash Carter and Frank Kendall at the Pentagon for 4 years, so I can talk Pentagonese. And then, as I mentioned, 17 years on the Hill, including 6 years on the staff of the House Armed Services Committee working acquisition policy. So I can bore you with statistics, I can bewilder you with Pentagonese, and I can frustrate you with congressional procedural talk, and try to do all of them. But hopefully I can add something more useful today. So the Center for Strategic International Studies, where I work now, does a lot of work on contract trend analysis and working with the widely available public data, the Federal Procurement Data System, and doing analysis of that. It's an amazing treasure trove of information that is bringing data and insights to these acquisition policy discussions that we haven't had before, and the many prior rounds of acquisition discussion, acquisition reform that have gone on, and I think it's a very good thing. We did a little bit of work in preparation for some testimony to the Small Business Committee this year, looking at small business contracting. And in the Federal Procurement Data System, small businesses are identified, they're self-identified. So as this report indicates, there are some issues with that fact, with the fact that the way that the data is captured doesn't give you 100% certainty that it's all accurate. But for trend analysis purposes, we feel like it's still very useful data because whatever flaws the data may have, we sort of assume they're going to be relatively consistent over time. That's a rebuttable assumption, but I think it's a fair one. So for trend analysis, it's a pretty good set of data. For regulatory policy, it's probably, there's still work to be done there, as the report indicates. Sort of a simple finding, but an overarching finding of our analysis is that the policies set within the Small Business Act are having profound effects on the shape of the contracting base for the federal government broadly, but specifically for DoD. And most of our analysis has been on the defense data, which, as Jack has very rightly said, tends to dominate the trends for the entire federal government because of its size. All of the growth since 2005 in small business contracting has been within the set-aside categories. There has been no growth and, in fact, a decline in the amount of contracting going to small businesses that don't qualify for one of the set-aside categories since 2005. That amount has fallen from $30 billion to about $25 billion over that period of time. And that's, by the way, for context, that's a period of time where total federal, or at least total defense, contract obligations have wound up at the same place. I can't say they've been flat because they went way up, and now they've come way down as a result of sequestration. So they're far from flat. But it so happens that the contract obligation total from 2005, the contract obligation total from 2014 are roughly the same. We've come back to where we started.
There's been an internal shift towards services from goods.
There have been several internal shifts, exactly right. And during that peak, there were lots of interesting things that happened, driven by the war spending, primarily. So my point is that these policies really are having profound effects. I know from my time on the Hill, sometimes you wondered, because the goals so frequently were not being met, hey, are these goals really even having an effect? And what's fascinating to me, looking at the data, is they're really having a profound effect. And that tells me that the Congress, the government in general, needs to be extremely focused in looking at what these goals are and what are they achieving their purposes, because they are definitely changing what's going on in industry. And so we need to make sure we have the policies we want, because we're going to get what we ask for, not necessarily what we want. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hill perspective, since Jack indicated that's why I'm here. I think there's actually quite a bit of opportunity right now on Capitol Hill to at least an opportunity for revisiting some of the ways in which the policies are set. During my time in Congress, and I think it's still largely true, the Defense Authorization Act has always been sort of the driving force for changes to acquisition policy, acquisition statute. And I think that continues to be true. The Armed Services Committees are deeply, deeply interested in revisiting acquisition policies generally. They don't have direct jurisdiction over small business policies. That belongs to the small business committees. But it's also my sense that based on having testified to the House Small Business Committee, that there is a renewed and maybe new interest there at considering changes to maybe not so much to set aside policies, but looking at the statutes that underpin the small business policy and considering changes. And I would note that the Defense Authorization Act last year actually made substantial changes in the Small Business Act for the first time in as many years as I can remember, first time in a very long time. So I think there is an opportunity on the Hill, and so the report, I think, is very timely.
Both the House and the Senate now have specific task forces looking at acquisition reform, so-called. And so this is bound to come up as part of that. I think
Yes.
You're right, Andrew.
Yeah, it's a major initiative for both chairmen, Senator McCain and Congressman Thornberry, and I'm shamelessly going to plug the fact that I think if you keep your eyes peeled, Congressman Thornberry is going to release some legislation, something in the order of a discussion draft that at a think tank near you. So just lastly, let me say that one of the things that I think is very well done in the report, and that will hopefully give it legs, is that it goes back to the first principles. And I always feel like when you're dealing with acquisition policy legislation, it's very easy to get bogged down in kind of the parochial interests and in the people have their policies that they've been supporting for a long time. And so you can get wrapped up in things like percentages and set aside goals. But as the report points out, the Small Business Act was passed for a reason. It was meant to strengthen the industrial base, to encourage competition, to create opportunities for small business, to create jobs, and to foster innovation. And so those are really the things that matter. And I think when you focus at that level, you can have a productive conversation on a bipartisan basis on the Hill about whether the policies and whether the statute as it stands is supporting those objectives. And then when you can reach some degree of maybe consensus or agreement on those objectives, then I think it's much easier to look at changes into the statute that may be more supportive of those objectives than where we are today. And I'll stop there.
Well, it's interesting to hear this congressional perspective that facts matter. It'd be nice if they did. Yeah. But it's very clear that there is a growing recognition, I think, and that's your point, and I agree with it, of the fact that it can be improved. And therefore, now that they have these task forces set up, it makes sense to fold that into it. Stan?
Thanks, Jack. And, thanks for including us in this. It's actually a couple of caveats. When Jack refers to an agency in the past, it's actually that I worked for him, so you know that I will agree with everything he says. In fact, I found out after I took the job at PSC that he was the reason I actually got recruited there. So thank you, sir. What can I do to serve you today?
That was your punishment.
That was my punishment. I want to pick up start where Andrew actually left off and offer a couple of observations. And I think that the value of this report is that it raises some really, really significant questions, but I think it requires us to step back a little bit, and Andrew touched on this a little bit. I think we have to start with the premise of go back to the question of what is the purpose of the Small Business Act and of small business goals. The fact is that there are multiple purposes and they are often in conflict, and that's one of the challenges. So let me give you an example. If one of the objectives of the small business goals, legitimately so, is to find innovation in small companies that are out there doing really incredible stuff, that's very different than routine sort of, I'll call them lifestyle companies of your local small business, the local newsstand, the local dry cleaner, which is a very legitimate, important part of our economy and a source of jobs, but it's not where the innovations are coming from. Yet we have one policy to peanut butter spread across the entire small business base. So we don't actually think about it in different segments. The second thing is, and this is my own self-interest, a parochial interest as the head of a trade association, Deepak is chair of our membership committee. We have about 40% small business, I think, right now. I have every incentive to want every one of those small businesses to grow because we make more money, because your dues go up as you get bigger, unless you're like Saitor and you go sell to a larger company, which is a whole other issue. But as I talk to our small businesses, they are far more concerned, and I think let Deepak speak to this because he was once one and has grown a company spectacularly. They are far more concerned with what happens after they cross that line than they are about getting through the initial tranche of getting to the goals, getting to their size standard. Whereas in other segments of small business across our economy, surviving within that size is an issue. So you have to really think about it from a number of different perspectives. When we talk about job creation, I find it fascinating. One of the challenges we've had with one of the services, military services at DoD, has been, as they looked across their spend, they realized that they weren't hitting their small business goals a few years ago. So they said, okay, how can we find ways to do it? So they're jamming everything they can into one category. And by their own data, within sort of professional services, knowledge-based services, and so forth, they're at nearly 40% small business. In R&D, they're in the low single digits. Clearly, in weapons systems, you're going to be low single digits by definition. I mean, I think Jack's point is a really important one. So then you ask them, so where's the job creation? Because what's happening is simply badge shifting. People who work for one company, the work gets broken up into small companies, they go to work for the small company. Folks aren't losing their jobs, they're just badge flipping, but you're not creating jobs. So how is that helping a job creation strategy, which is what part of the small business goal is? So I think there's a number of questions we need to step back and ask about how the program is structured and how we think about it. And it really goes back to me, the fundamental question is our goal to create a small business which has certain great value in and of itself, or is it to create a sustainable enterprise, which is an entirely different question. And I think on the latter, we have some real challenges. We've done a fair amount of work in this area looking at the different sizes and so forth. And I think to Andrew's point, we actually partnered with CSIS on the first study of this back in 2004, I think it was. And they've been every 2 years updating the data. And it was when we first started seeing where some of the shifts were taking place. But what we're now increasingly becoming aware of is that the shifts are not universal and they're not monolithic. So again, to Jack's point about whether it's contract bundling or it's the reduced share of the market to small or it's set aside versus regular small, you have to get down in a pretty granular territory to figure out where is that happening and why. I mean, there's no universal data available. We're doing some work on, I think one of the first things that came to me as I read the study is we have a desperate need for more data, but it has to be not just global, it's got to be micro level, because this is not a macro question. When people say to me, well, what's the services sector think? I say, well, which part of the sector? There are a number of our member companies in here, and they're all in different parts of the sector. The services industry is not an industry. It's an amalgamation of industries. Each of them has their own dynamics, has their own market forces, and so forth. And so I think we have to begin to think about the whole marketplace that way, much like we say you're either small or other than small. Well, that's not the way the world works. And that's not. And to Jack's point about the services industry, 25 years ago, the services industry was pretty much some small businesses, and mostly mid-tier. That was mostly what it was when Jack was at Task and so forth years ago. That's not the case anymore. It is an enormous, incredibly diverse, multi-layered sector, and we don't think about all of these implications along those lines. So let me just take that sort of rant and actually make some very specific suggestions that I think are important to maybe some recommendations for actual action. And these are things we'll actually be testifying to this next week before the Small Business Committee. We're going to raise some of these questions with them. First of all, is the data question. We have lousy data. We know that. I think that's an easy one to put on the table and say, we've got to go figure this out. But we've got to figure it out at a much more granular level than we've even thought about it before. And we have to help the Hill understand the different elements of it, because I think Andrew will acknowledge that when he was on the Hill, and certainly when I was working for Jack and we were working acquisition policy and we bring the Small Business Committee, always came into the conversation. A lot of it was an education process about different kinds of small businesses in different segments of the marketplace and what the different implications were, and that continues to be a challenge. But the data is the obvious one. First, I think we're going to recommend that they consider, particularly in clear-cut cases where you can do it, providing independent past performance to first-tier subs. One of the very, very big issues for small businesses, one of the reasons they push so hard, not whether it's set aside or not, is that you cannot compete for government work as a prime unless you have your own past performance. And so as a subcontractor, I don't get to build my past performance record. I don't have the quals. So one of the ways to get at it for a first tier would be to say, why are we not giving independent past performance to first tier subs? Second, this will be really controversial, and I hope it will be, and I hope it'll spark a really serious debate. This is sort of my pet peeve, actually. I think for DoD particularly, we ought to have separate goals for hardware and services. The idea that you would have a 23% or 22% goal across a department that has such an incredible range of requirements is absurd. Because you know for a fact, as we've already said, on the hardware side, I'm not going to get out of the single digits. It's not possible to build a Joint Strike Fighter with a set-aside. However, you could do a whole lot more in R&D. As Jack said, there's about a 4-to-1 ratio in R&D spending, commercial versus government. About 70% of DoD's R&D budget today goes to existing programs. And so there's a lot of opportunity to use small business and R&D, but you're probably not going to get to 22 or 23%. So why do we have the same goals in R&D that we have for knowledge-based services and services generally? So, you know, I think in our view, in our community, we'd be willing to accept a higher than 23% goal for services if we could get out of this game of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So if you look at, for instance, and I won't name the services, I'm not trying to get in here to poke my finger in anybody's eye, but the one service that has basically said, we're taking all of our CETA work and we're going to try to look everywhere we can to put it into small business, not because we think it's good for mission, and I'm not criticizing small business, but their reason stated is, we've got to find a way to hit our department-wide goal. That is a really bad reason to do this. That's not what the Small Business Act was created for. That's not driving innovation, that's not creating jobs, and so forth. I think a third area that's more global than just small business, but is clearly tied to this, and Jack touched on this, is the administration has talked a lot about better buying power, has talked a lot about barriers to entry and compliance costs. And I just say straight out, having worked a lot on it, we have done almost nothing about them. In fact, the compliance costs are going up. And as much as compliance costs go up, you create more barriers to entry. So as we have objectives from the White House and from various departments to reach out to Silicon Valley and other places for some of the really creative, innovative capabilities that are being developed, they look at the system and exactly what Jack says. They're not going to live by this for any sustained period of time. And I'll use the example of other transactions authority. We've had other transactions authority for decades. And I think when we studied it back in the day, it was about 65% of the dollars went to large primes because they were using it as legitimately as a tool to get non-traditional, innovative capabilities into the system. The problem was, as soon as you got into that sort of final development, head towards production role, you rolled back under the traditional FAR rules and all the compliance requirements under Part 15 and so forth. That became kind of an unsustainable and untenable environment for companies that really had much larger opportunities in a commercial space. So what we're seeing now are some feet being dangled in the water from the Valley or Austin or other tech centers around the country and opportunities that they're seeing in the government and interest, but they're never going to go in deep and build the scale with in the kinds of ways we would like if we don't address the opportunities, the barriers to entry. And I think tied to that is the question of set-asides themselves. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of them. We are strong supporters of the program as it exists, but what we don't need are any more set-asides. The President's budget actually has a proposal in it to create a new set-aside. I believe it would be the first small business set-aside that is not socioeconomic in nature, but I could be wrong. It's not a program like SBIR, but it would be a set-aside that would be available to small businesses with, quote, limited, end quote, government experience. We're not sure what that means, that bring innovation to the table. There are a number of acquisition people in the room. I'm looking at one over here. That seems to me to be a fairly subjective set of criteria for a set-aside. But why would we presume that we want to lower the barriers to entry just to small companies that have innovation? What if there are new entries that are giant companies that have innovation? What if there are existing traditional players that have innovation? We don't need to further segment the market. We need to step back and think much more strategically and much more granularly about what the market looks like, how the different elements of the market behave and are driven and affected by different pieces of the policy, and take it piece by piece. And I think if you do that, you can then roll this into far more of a strategic discussion as part of acquisition strategies and so forth, to try to really think through how you want to build your long-term industrial base as broad and as open and competitive as possible, rather than relying on a constant dripping of new reg, new set aside, new set aside. It actually, and I say this again in all seriousness, is as much, if not more, of a concern for our small businesses as anybody else, because as you will hear from Deepak, the challenges of coming out of that into the real world, to the full and open world, are really significant. And so I think that would be beneficial. Taking these kinds of approaches would help small business. It would open more opportunities for small business across more segments of the market, rather than saying, well, if you do CETA work, you can come work with us, but we're not interested in anything else from small business. It would open up more opportunities for small businesses to grow, and obviously it would help balance, to the extent you can balance, the industrial base in the long term. So with that, let me turn it over to Deepak.
Thank you very much, everybody. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me on this esteemed panel. I am delighted to be here and share with you my experiences through this whole thing. I do want to correct something that Stan said. Stan said we were a small business once, and what I want to correct is, unfortunately, we were a small business twice, and I'll explain that shortly. But before I do that, I did want to make a few comments. Being an entrepreneur in the greatest nation on the earth is one of the best feelings in the world, and it has been a personally very rewarding experience for me going through this entire transition. I think small businesses have a very critical role to play, but I think the processes today are very antiquated and have not kept up with the change, and I'll get to that in a minute. Just to tell you a little bit about the company. We started in 1990, entered the federal space in late 92, 93, entered the SBA area program in 94. And we're very successful in growing the company from 0 to about 30 million in about 2000, when we graduated the small business size standards. And once we graduated, we found it very difficult for a number of different reasons on how to scale the business from there. And what happened is our revenues went from 30 million to 21 to 16 to 13. And we got back into the small business program. And the only reason we could sustain that is because we had a very strong balance sheet, and our goal was to build a long-sustaining business as opposed to a lifestyle business. We were very fortunate that we had that runway. We were able to transition the business, get out of the small business for the second time, and build a business that was sustainable. And today we are fortunate that we have grown the business very well through a number of different ways, focused mainly on national security, both in the IC, DoD, and the Fed civil market. Things that really impacted us, I think, in the small business program, I think the incentives are misaligned with what reality is. The plan is to build businesses and foster growth, but I don't think what the government doesn't do effectively is measure how many businesses actually are sustained after they graduate out of the small business program. If you look at that statistic, you will be alarmed at the number of businesses that are not in business within 3 years after graduating, or 5 years. And that is what you want to look at, is how do you sustain a business after getting out of the small business program? And it is definitely a challenging road, specifically because the market has changed drastically due to the conversions of technology and services, and the rules and regulations have not kept up with it. The second thing, I think, is the methodology used to define the goals. And that process has not kept up with the change in the marketplace. It's still very antiquated. The process used to build those goals have not kept up with the market, and that significantly impacts businesses such as ours, who continue to grow out of the small business and try to make that transition out. And the third thing I do want to state is, being a mid-sized business or graduating, you get squeezed from both the large and the small. And when somebody tells you, we have no mid-tier administration, we can't help you, go do something else, there are a lot of barriers for you to grow. And what I think was important for us is that we really focused on the mission of the agencies that we worked with, understood them, and built a platform that we could grow with. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to change the way we look at small businesses and how they build mid-tier businesses and what it's necessary for them to be successful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ganslev.
controversial topics into this, and so hopefully you have some questions, and you can direct them to any one of the four of us, or all four of us at the same time. But please take advantage of this. Anybody have any suggestions? Yeah.
Tom Lambert with KBR. A general question about the rule of two in the services arena. You know, with the requirement to set aside any work that two or more small businesses can demonstrate that they're capable of doing, and with ANCs that have multi-billion-dollar corporations to back them, we see a growing trend of more and more of the core work that mid-sized and large-sized businesses would be interested in going after being set aside for small businesses. Is that rule of two really going a little too far now, that more and more of that work's been demonstrated that could be done by small businesses, and what's to keep this thing from rolling up even further?
Stan?
Tom, you raise a really interesting question, one that's sort of perplexed me for a long time, and you and I probably even talked about it over the last 20 years. My interpretation, and I'm looking at Harry Halleck here because he might be able to correct me on this, my interpretation of the rule of two always has been that if there are two or more small businesses that can do the work, not if there are two or more small businesses that can do 51% of the work. And I think that's part of the problem. The presumption is that we've defined doing the work as 50.1%. Now, that may or may not be a legally accurate interpretation of the law and the rule, but I believe the intent was to say, if I've got small business, if there's a small business who can do all of it, and I get two or three of them, I want to give it to small businesses. I'm going to help grow small business. That's hard to argue with. Where I get stuck and where I think we've seen the imbalance is that but doing the work has been defined as 50.1%. And so I think that's, to me, that's the crux issue. Now, is there a way to deal with this issue? Is it politically feasible? Wow. I mean, I think Andrew will agree from his years on the committee, and I know Jack and I went through this when we were in the building. You start bringing all the committees into play here that have some jurisdiction, and you want to start debating some small business policies, it can get pretty interesting. And, you know, the trade offers get to be even scarier than the status quo. So I don't know if there's, I don't know how to, as I said, perplexes me. I don't know how to focus on it because I actually agree that I think it's gone overboard because I think it's a misinterpretation of what the intent is. I can't say, because I'm not a lawyer, that it's legally inaccurate, but I think it's that 51% has now become determined as you're doing the work. And then you get credit for the whole damn contract, right?
Yeah, that's contrasted to having a few large firms working for you. When you make your offer, can you do the work? You know? I mean, the concept behind the rule of two makes a lot of sense, right, in the sense of competition. There's no question that there's piles of empirical data of the value of competition in terms of innovation, in terms of cost, in terms of delivery schedules, and so forth. That's where it's coming from. But I think I agree with Stan that it's interpretation.
Well, and I think also, I'm going to give this to Andrew because he's now a think tank guy, having done his time making policy. Now he can just prognosticate and pontificate and so forth. I think a great research project would be, frankly, and this gets partially the rule of two question, but a little bit more broadly. If we could even get the data, we can talk about maybe even partnering on something like this. A fabulous research project would be to look over the last 5 to 7 years in certain product service codes. Let's take it into the more entrepreneurial PSCs as opposed to the lifestyle PSCs. And I don't mean that in any judgmental way, but there are certain categories of work where people have a different focus. And try to identify how small businesses have grown. Has it been actually through set-asides, or has it been through competing for full and open? I can tell you there are any number of member companies of ours that have been successful as small businesses and grown beyond the size standards who have never done a set-aside. I mean, they have competed from day one, building an infrastructure that gave them the capability and the understanding of bidding in a completely different environment. And they take great pride in it, as they should. So it'd be interesting to see from a success ratio as you're looking not only survival rates, but how did you get there? Because I think part of the goal here has to be to make this work better for small business.
Well, there's
And
a
the
second-
nation.
And the nation, right?
There was a second half to your question that I think is important, worth mentioning, although it's a little trepidatious, but it's the question of the ANCs and how big some of them have grown. And I think that's another case where the policy was set in statute for a reason. The intent was to grow these firms and to develop businesses that could be successful in that population, and it has succeeded in achieving that objective. There are now some very large firms that operate in that space, and the question is, they were given fairly robust policy, I'm going to say, protections, and the question becomes, do those protections continue to make sense to operate in the same way, in an almost unlimited way, when the objective has, in some sense, been achieved?
Well, I think that this is, it's actually analogous to the whole dynamic of the small business debate and the politics of small business. The purpose of the ANC program actually is a valid purpose. Has it grown too large? One of the things I think you'll find with a lot of the ANCs now, we have several that are members, we've talked about this. As many of you know, we have this conversation fairly frequently. They recognize that there may be some changes coming to the program where they're required to compete in different ways at different sizes, and some of the freedoms may actually go away. That doesn't mean that some of the bedrock principles underneath the program, given the remoteness of Alaska and so forth, don't still continue. But it requires people to be able to step back and have a rational debate without getting, up on a fire, and that's what happens in small business. It's large versus small. It's good, bad. It's none of those things. It all has a place and a part. You have to have a rational conversation.
Let me give you a different perspective on that rule of two and what it does for businesses. When an agency awards a contract that's several times the size of the company, it pretty much sets up the company for failure. When a small business is awarded a $500 million small business contract, I think that's a problem. And I think to meet the goals, the rule of two is used to try. The rule of two is used to try and meet those goals, without understanding the consequences of awarding such large contracts in small business. And I think part of the study has to be, if the company wins it, has anybody studied what is the impact on the company and what is the sustainability of the company after that contract? And I think I'm not sure if that data is available, but it does work against the sustainment and the growth of companies.
Well, and I think that's not just a rule of two question. I think that's an interesting question also, and I don't know how to answer this one. I mean, again, these are really tough issues and controversial. I don't know the right answer, but there has been a lot of discussion quietly about, do you put caps on small business awards tied to the market cap of the company winning the award? Is that fair? Is it not fair? Some companies can do amazing things. I mean, there are companies with very few people who, using technology, can do have massive capabilities. And how do you break that out? It's really, really tough. But I think Deepak has put his finger on one of the questions, which is how are we using it? The second thing is, we hear about awards for $100 million going to $5 million companies, and you really look at it, what it is, it's a multiple award vehicle with a cap of $100 million. It could be $8 million a year over 5 years, the average play. So that's not we're talking really single awards or task orders that start taking you out of whack, because multiple award vehicles kind of mess up all the data anyway, because you have contract caps versus actual task orders.
One thing that strikes me, Stan, you mentioned earlier the importance of past performance. And the rule of two is intended to get two highly qualified firms to be able to do this particular task.
So they can build right.
The fact that they say they're in that business and have no historical proof of how they did, it strikes me as that historic data would be the past performance is a real problem right now for big companies too, in terms of the government not, low price technically acceptable, making awards on that basis rather than on past performance or best value, if you will.
But as you said, I mean, the rule of two has a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
It opens the door to new players who may not have to create it. But when it's 50.1 versus 49.9% of the work, the question is, are you better off having it as a full and open competition and giving that contract, that small business, the opportunity to build independent past performance as a sub, rather than layering on them potentially overwhelming financial and other responsibilities for execution? That's where you sort of get into the back end.
Okay, let me throw it open again, but let me request again that you identify yourself and your company when you ask a question.
Me? Harry Halleck, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Procurement. Stan, first of all, I do agree with your supposition in the same DPAC. What's fascinating to me, as far back as I can remember, and one of the leading figures back then, Deirdre Lee, when she was up at OSD, was talking about having a dialogue with SBA on some of these things. And it never seems to, and I'm not knocking SBA at all. In fact, I think it's all about, people are following that goal, meet the goal. They're so intent on meeting the goal, they're forgetting the reason for the goal. And I think we've gotten to a point where we need to stop and say, okay, these goals have gone a long way. Now we need to stop and look at, okay, is it about the goals now, or is there some other things? And the one that I've always asked about, and I can say this because I work for the Army, the Eagle contract that many people might be familiar with, I never did understand the logic of the small business set-aside where they set, the target for task orders at the ceiling for being a small business. So the minute you got a task order, you weren't a small business anymore.
And then you can't recompete.
Right, and then you can't recompete. So what's the sense of that? And do we track success afterward? And we don't do it very well. I'd also like to sort of turn this a little bit. You talked about, Stan talked about whether you be a sub or whether you're a prime. And my experience over the years has been, it's really interesting that it seems to go back and forth. There are times where I have subs, when I was out there as a contracting officer, coming to me saying, I don't want to be a sub, I want to be a prime.
Absolutely.
And of course, the barriers we talk about. And also, what I was going to ask the question, which was, in your study, did you talk to small businesses, and did you have a dialogue about being a prime versus a sub? Because I think there's several benefits, frankly, to being a prime once you can get through the barriers. And one of them is a financing. When you talk about, I think and I could be wrong, that the government does a better job of that financing, not necessarily that initial, but once you get the contract and then through progress payments or performance-based payments or those types of things. So I get the idea. I like the fact that we should count both sub and prime. You made reference, I think, to maybe counting sub a little higher than prime, and I don't.
No. What I was saying is, and then Jack, to address your question about the study itself, what I was saying was, and I agree with you, but very few people want to live as a sub. I mean, there's some companies happy with it, but very few companies want to exist as a sub. But the way out of being a sub is you have to find a way to get some independent past performance. And so there are going to be cases where if I can give that first tier sub their own past performance, because on that contract it makes sense not to make it a set aside, but I got this great company over here, they can get their own past performance, and then they can go compete independently the next time. That's what I was saying.
Let me introduce Bill Lucincian in the back of the room here. Bill, you did a lot of the interviewing. Did this topic come up with the small companies?
Well, it absolutely did. I think most of the small companies recognize the value of being a prime, and of course they'd like to be a prime. But there were some companies that recognize the value of being a sub and the nurturing environment that they get from being a sub and allowing them to flesh out their processes, their internal processes, and the staffing and all that. And so, of course, I think everybody likes to be the boss, but I think to go to Deepak's point, many of the smaller companies are probably not ready for some of these big contracts, some of these big roles, and so they'd be better suited to be a sub.
But one of the problems that exists, and I don't know if Deepak experienced this as a small business or even now as a mid-tier, one of the problems when you get into an environment like we're in now with budget squeezes, if you're a sub, you may be the victim first and foremost, right? And so life gets tougher in a tough market. And so the pressure to find prime opportunities become even greater, and they're very understandable. So it can actually be a very difficult challenge to be a sub, but then as margins and everything else gets squeezed, you could get squeezed even more.
Let me just correct you will get squeezed even more, because primes will tend to protect their base first before they protect their subs. And that's one of the downsides of it. The other point I do want to make is the rules, the way they are set up for small businesses to stay small. Because once you get out of that small business size standard, you are in no man's land. You're either small or you're other than small. And when you get out of that space, it becomes unless you have positioned the company to be very mission specific and very focused on certain clients, it's very difficult to succeed. So I think a lot of companies tend to stay small, and they want to stay small because they know it's very difficult to grow. And I think that's against the grain of what the rules and regulations are for, to sustain and build businesses.
Yeah.
Brian Friel with Bloomberg. Deepak, maybe if you don't mind, if I can challenge you a little bit and
Sure.
make the argument that you're kind of an example of the success of the program, right? That you grew out of small business size, so arguably you show that the current system works. The second part of my question is just getting to that question about mid-tiers. Do you see any potential policy changes that could help mid-tiers compete more given the increase in small business set size?
Right. So let me answer your first point. It was a very painful transition for us, extremely painful. And the only reason we sustained that is because we had a very strong balance sheet. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today. We pretty much drove the business off the cliff. Because once you graduate, it's very, very difficult to play in the mid-tier market. Because you get squeezed both from the smalls and the largest. And there has to be, I don't support another mid-tier, but a mid-tier size standard. What I do support is allowing mid-tier businesses to grow and succeed, and having the right policies in place to allow that to happen. I forgot the second part of your question.
What are some of those changes? What are some things that the government could do to make it easier for mid-tiers?
Right. So I'll give you one example. Take, for example, the Aligned contract out of GSA. You have an Aligned Small and you have an Aligned Large, two separate contracts. You get the contract as a small business, you're extremely successful. It's a 10-year contract. At 5 years, you recertify. You're no longer small. You lose the contract. Some agencies will terminate all your task orders. What I think should be allowed is there should be a ramp off and a ramp on into the large, which allows the company to continue to grow through that transition. And that there's nothing that supports that today. And I think that's things like that today in the nature of GWACs and MACs that are in the government, something like that would be very, very helpful.
Let me add to that if I could, Brian, because I think there are a couple other points. One is, and I don't want to speak for Vistronics, but a number of companies that I've watched grow, come down, grow, not make it, what have you. There are also, let's not miss the fact that there are internal factors that have nothing to do with the marketplace that dramatically impact companies. You become too reliant on certain kinds of contracts, too reliant on certain business models without maturing your infrastructure, maturing your management and so forth. There are all kinds of challenges. It's not just the system. So I think it's more complex than that. But back to the policy question, I'll give you another example of what, I'll use Alliant, could use the new GSA vehicle HCATS, which is the big training, the $2 billion training contract. One of the things that we've argued vociferously about is, should all companies who are not competing on the small side be required to have all of the capabilities on the other than small side, the full and open side? Well, if you really understand the marketplace, understand the diversity of the marketplace, the answer should be no. And I think what I worry about is that we're getting to acquisition strategies that are built more around convenience and efficiency than they are about really market knowledge and really using that market knowledge to get the best and the broadest array of capabilities. So if there are 5 categories of work with 10 functional areas in each category, and if you want to compete, you've got to be in all 5 categories with all 10 functional areas. There are not very many small businesses, mid-tier businesses that can do that. But there are going to be a lot that can do 2 categories, might be able to do 3 and 3. And it's not that hard. You just say you can only compete in the ones you qualify for. I mean, there's ways to manage it. So there are things you could do. And the other thing is, on major acquisitions, is having an industrial base element to the acquisition strategy. To really think through, how do I actually approach and what kind of an industrial base do I want? How can I find components, even in R&D? How could I legitimately and smartly access different size companies for different kinds of work? That is actually not a factor in other than weapon systems do have to do an industrial base analysis, but it's more about the prime industrial base than it is about the others. In the case of services, which is almost 70% of what the government buys, 65%, that's not even considered. So there are things you could do along those lines.
Can I add one thought here, which is to step maybe to a slightly larger context.
Well, you're a
and I think
think
there's
tank. We expect that.
yeah, the system creates a lot of incentives, and the formal goal may not set that as policy, but it's implied. And so obviously the fact that the goal focuses only on prime means that there's some sort of a disincentive to use small businesses as subcontractors because you didn't get credit for that. And so there's no formal policy that discourages using small business as subs, but there's sort of an implicit incentive in the system. And I would say to this issue of small businesses graduating outside of the side standard, combine that with the fact that in the broader defense industry, companies are increasingly using all of their cash flow for dividends and share buybacks, and they're investing very little proportionally into R&D, or certainly the trends are not very encouraging. And so So you reach a situation where the big companies may decide that the right way to acquire new technology, since we're not investing in it ourselves, is to go buy small businesses who've developed it. And oh, by the way, for the small business, that may solve their problem of how do I get over this, this gap, this area of squeeze between being a small firm and a mid-sized firm. Well, if I sell out to a big company, that solves that problem. That company knows how to handle that problem, and they have the resources of a big firm. Now, that may or may not be a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that that's a negative necessarily in industry, but I think the system is creating a dynamic where that drives companies in that direction on both ends of the spectrum. And the question then becomes, is that the policy that we really want?
Both of you have raised the question of, don't forget that the objective here is innovation. And, you don't want to kill that. And sometimes that does happen with a large firm, because especially if it's disruptive innovation, it changes the model for the industry. I'm sure you've all read about, Clay Christensen's stuff and a lot of Kuhn's work and things of that sort, which talk about changing the paradigm. Where that's one of the things we really need is the disruptive innovation in order to stay ahead, to be doing the next kind of thing. And that's why DARPA got set up, for example. And that's where, obviously, the internet came from. And I have a little sketch in my office of the drawing for the first internet from DARPA. I mean, that's the kind of things that Stan was mentioning, services. Can we come up with some innovative services? That's one of the things we hope to get out of the small businesses. Okay, more questions. We have time.
Oh, Don.
Okay. No.
Next.
A couple of suggestions, and we can pose these as questions or suggestions, but we have a couple of companies here, Deepak being one, Cytor being another, that successfully graduated from the small business to become successful mid-tier and in some cases large. We've got PSC, CSIS. What about a conference where you would call in those company leaders who've taken their companies through that painful abyss and became successful, and talk about, okay, here's the problems you're going to face, here's what we did, and then invite massive amounts of small businesses to learn from the people who've gone through that as a possibility. That's one suggestion. People talk about graduating. Every time I've ever graduated from anything, there have been certain standards and requirements. And I posed this question to some senior people at SBA. What are your graduation requirements? Well, it's dollars or employee numbers. Boom, and now you're successful. What about if you put in there infrastructure requirements, management requirements, all the things you need to run a successful mid-tier, that those are included in that, other than just dollar value or employee level. And the third thing is, a suggestion is, when we, a lot of these large MAC IDIQs have gone small business only. What if we say a percentage of those, 25, 30% of those task orders would go full and open, not just small business, to allow those small businesses to compete so that they can build a large business backlog and not just small business contracts, so that when they get to their level, boom, they've got a large business backlog they can seek.
Yeah, so let me just quickly on those. I think your first suggestion is a great one. We've done some of that, and I think you can always do more. We've had several forums. I think Deepak's participated in them at the Chamber of Commerce and so forth, where we've talked about those things. I have to admit, your second suggestion, while logical and rational, scares the heck out of me. I really don't think I want SBA getting in the business of telling companies what their infrastructure and management capabilities need to be. I'm not sure any government agency really is going to understand the variety of capabilities required in different kinds of. I mean, you start setting that up, and it's going to be a nightmare. But I understand the point. On the third one, I fully agree. I mean, we've seen not a lot, but some cases where large capabilities, and I think we've seen a couple at Wright-Patterson and other places where entire previously full and open contracts have been just thoroughly thrown into a set-aside MAC, and that's no smarter than not having any small business at all either. I mean, that's just the extreme reaction the other way. It has exactly the same, in the reverse order, the same kind of impacts on both the capabilities and the quality for the customer. And that's what, getting back to what I said before, I think you can balance these things out and need to balance these things out. And so what they did on Alliant is they had Alliant and they had Alliant Small. The problem was Alliant was structured in such a way, if you weren't a really large company, you really couldn't bid Alliant full and open. But there could have been ways to do it that a variety of other companies would have qualified if they didn't have to qualify across this massive capabilities of this big requirements contract they structured. So I think there are a number of different pieces to that.
I mean, it's the same thing with the Oasis contract too.
Yeah.
You've got, if you're a mid-tier, it becomes very, very difficult for you to prime a contract, which is of significant importance for a mid-tier to grow and succeed. Right. The way it was structured is, if you're small, you can be successful. If you're large, you can be successful. If you're mid-tier, there's no place for you. And I think that works against the companies who have been successful in the past.
There needs to be some ramp to get to that success.
So there's only a ramp. Let me go back to the Oasis example, because I think it's a great example of also thinking this stuff through really in-depth at the acquisition strategy phase rather than later on. The idea of Oasis was to create a vehicle that would offer agencies complex integration capabilities. By definition, that was probably going to be mostly mid to larger mid companies. It was not going to be an enormous market, but it was a very specialized, we're going to do this. That's not how it's being used. The customers are not using it that way. So therefore, the market research that went into creating Oasis is inconsistent with the way Oasis is being executed. Now go back to Deepak's point. If Oasis had been structured differently, Deepak could clearly have competed on it because it's not being used for big, large, complex integration. It's being used for one-off services to get to 4 schedules at once. I mean, the Air Force has all flat out said that's how they're using it, and it's perfectly legal and legitimate, but it was not the original intent. So this stuff wasn't actually, I don't think, effectively and adequately thought through at the acquisition strategy phase.
The government needs to take the lead.
That's right. That's the strategy.
in
and
this,
right.
because particularly where you're counting on the large company to do the integration, all the subsystems can be set aside if they're eligible for if they fit, if they have the qualifications and so forth. Okay.
Well, this is Joe Wysocki from Cytor Market Development, and in fact, that was my question or comment was going to be addressing the way Oasis is being utilized in execution. When it was conceived and bid, to have categories in large and small certainly drove a large number of large companies to invest heavily to become qualified and gain an Oasis contract, which they've done. But in execution, it does seem like it's the perfect vehicle for the services to attain their goal for the 23%. And so we're observing that so many of the major command IDIQ acquisitions are now going on the small side. Many large companies that competed are wondering, why did I invest? This was to be a vehicle for me to hopefully compete in these arenas, and now it's shut off. So what would you say to those companies, and what could be done to possibly, I think the study had a suggestion that at least preserving a certain percentage of full and open in every major category, just like Stan, I think you alluded to something like that earlier. Are those possible solutions to give hope to large companies that got those?
Well, I think, Joe, I think Oasis is not actually a good example of what you just said, because Oasis was not a case where they were going entirely small business. Oasis was largely full and open. The problem was I don't think the acquisition strategy matched what the market was really looking for and how it was going to use it. And that's how, at the end of the day, I think larger companies ended up investing, and will find that they're not going to get as much back for their investment because the execution of the contract is not what was anticipated up front. That's different than the question of the wisdom of having everything shunted aside to small or everything shunted into full and open. I do think there needs to be a balance. And typically there is, I think in the Air Force case specifically with Wright-Patterson and so forth, they did something beyond just go to small business. One of the things they did was they used the manufacturing, the employee standards, the size standards. So it's companies, I think it's 1,500, is that the size standard at the Wright-Patterson contract? I think it's 1,500. So that's not a tiny company, that's a $150 million company. So now you've captured the small mid-tier. So there's a lot of gradations to this and how they do it. And so I get back to, and it's I don't mean to be Pollyanna about it, but I think that we need to develop collectively a much better market sense amongst the folks who are developing these strategies, so they're doing what actually makes sense for them as the customer first, and secondly, for a balanced market. And so when you get a case like Oasis, where the execution of the contract is actually quite different than what it was at least portrayed to be, then that's where you get the disconnect and the imbalance. And you ask me, what do I say to a company? I go, I mean, what am I going to say? You know, but just follow me? Does that?
Bill, you had
We looked at virtually everybody we talked to brought up the issue of waste and abuse in the small business set-aside program. One of the topics that hasn't come up with the panel is the abuses and how they could be curbed. I'd like to get your perspectives on what the level of abuses are in the small business set-aside program and what actions the government might be able to take to help curb those without imposing an unnecessarily increased burden of audits and inspections and so on.
Yeah.
and there's a complementary question to that, which is how much in the government training programs is this area emphasized? You know, because I was shocked to find that the DAU, for example, doesn't even have training on best practices, commercial best practices. You may have experienced that.
Yeah, Bill, I have to tell you honestly. I mean, I know that topic comes up. I have not seen any data that says that there's a higher or lower percentage of abuse of one kind or another in small business versus other than small business versus inside government performance of anything. I haven't seen any data that definitively shows that one sector or the other is a worse behavior, if you will, whether it's inside the government, big business, mid-size, or small. So I really can't address that piece. I can say that some of and I don't think this is the kind of fraud that you were talking about, and certainly not what you raised in the report. So, but some of the hyperbole around small business has been coming from the Hill, alleging that very substantial percentages of work that is classified as being performed by small business is actually being performed by large businesses. And what we found as we've looked at that data, and I will not suggest we've done a all the way down dig through it, but as we've looked at it, a sizable percentage of that is work that was perfectly legitimately awarded to a small business at the time it was awarded, and the government continues to take credit for it after the acquisition of the company or what have you. And so there are some transitional issues and so forth, but that's not, in my view, that's not necessarily fraud. That's some of it's perfectly legitimate. If Vistronics was a small business, they win a $10 million contract, and then they get bought by Cytor, that's still $10 million. That contract was a small business award, legitimately. There's no game there. It was a small business award. And so good for Vistronics. They had their liquidity event and sold, and you know it's a success story. So I think there's some of that in there too. But in terms of actual fraud, I just haven't seen any data that suggests. We know it exists. I mean, we know it exists kind of sadly across inside government, outside government, and commercial world, and so forth. I've just not seen any data that suggests that it's worse in this than others.
Deepak, do you want to comment on that?
No, the only comment I have is there's abuse. There's always, just like Stan says, there's always abuse in the system. I just don't know the level of abuse in the system. And I don't have an answer to that, unfortunately.
More questions? Yeah.
Congratulations, School of Public Policy. I think the study opens up the conversation in a way that is very valuable. It's a good start. But going back to Stan's point about the data, and particularly the kind of data that would lead to understanding incentives in this multi-layered, services sector that most of us are part of. Who do you think, how do you think is the best way to get at that kind of data? And for Andrew, from your perspective, what is the...
Tell John Hammer you were told in this meeting to get that data.
What is the nature that would be most useful, the nature of that data that would be most useful to feed into an NDAA process or an acquisition reform process? Separately, but while I got the mic, I would love to know, Deepak, if you care to share with it. I just imagine that at some point in the arc of your company, you considered a strategy of staying small. And
We didn't have an option. We were forced into it, let me put it that way. It was not by choice.
any insights into kind of that calculation among smalls, who are legally, taking actions to stay small so that they don't experienced that, that rift of graduating and how you get at those incentives. Thank you.
Let me just, if I could talk to the data question. So I have to say that the data in FPDS is incredibly rich. And it does contain basically all of the ingredients that you would need to do the kind of detailed analysis that Stan suggested and that you suggested. And I can only heartily endorse, I'm highly self-interested, but potentially highly self-interested, but I can only highly endorse the concept that there's a lot to be gained by analyzing this data. It has all the information about which firms are small, going back over time, and so you can track those who are no longer small. And tie that to the DUNS number. There's data about all the product service codes, so what kind of business, what kind of contract, what kind of work is actually being done. So there's I mean, the data is really there. It's a matter of getting into it and crunching it, which unfortunately or fortunately is not cost-free. And so it does require someone to kind of step up to the plate to fund that analysis. But I think I can't, offhand think of any gaps in the data that would in any way hinder doing a pretty sophisticated analysis of the questions that Stan has suggested.
Actually, I agree with 80% of what Andrew said. I think actually there are some gaps in the data we're discovering. I mean this seriously. We're taking a run at least on some sample areas, seeing how deep we can go in the data. We obviously don't have the resources to invest millions of dollars in it, unless you want to pay for it. But there are gaps, and one of the challenges is, for instance, that many companies have multiple DUNS numbers, and you have to figure out how to get to the parent DUNS. If you look at, particularly in services, less so in hardware, but if you look in services, the definitions of the different product service codes shift over time. And so if you go back to 2012, one of the largest PSCs, the definition is different today. And so you have to figure out where did it come from, and so what are you drawing from? So if it was adding that PSC, so there's a lot of pieces to it that make it actually kind of difficult. The data's there. It's actually not easy to aggregate in this sort of put together in the granular sense. But I think, and so we're taking a run at some of that. But I think there's a whole series of pieces to this. It's not just looking at the share of business and so forth. I think kinds of companies, different sectors, how they've done, where set-asides have played versus companies that have been purely full and open. I think that would be incredibly rich stuff for small businesses that are trying to grow, incredibly instructive. That's a whole big, maybe that's something that the school ought to do, just because it's the University of Maryland and it wants to support the regional economy.
But just besides getting the data, it seems to me the other area that needs a lot of focus is how to create the right incentives. And we have to call this to a halt in about 5 minutes, but I wanted to suggest that I'll give each of these a chance to make final comments, but if you have any additional questions or suggestions, that one of the things that I think is very important is that this meeting not end at 10 o'clock. Namely that follow-up, if you have suggestions for specific recommendations and how to create, for example, the incentives that just came up in that last question, that would be helpful. Okay. Someone had the microphone? Yeah.
Yes, good morning. I'm Lenny Manning from Defense Acquisition University.
Heard of that.
And just wanted to mention a couple things. I wanted to let everybody know that the DAU is currently in the process of setting up a new career field for the small business. We're developing, we anticipate right now anyway, 9 new additional small business courses. Also in the area of commercial items, we have training in that area.
Oh,
We're
good.
updating our training in that area now. We're waiting for the last update or the next update of the commercial item guide.
Terrific.
So that is ongoing. Okay.
I did suggest that to the Commandant last year when he was just appointed. That seemed to me that needed to be introduced. I'm glad it is now being introduced. That's a step forward. It really is. And I think your other step towards the small business is a very important one too, because if we're going to make changes, then the people in the government making these changes really need to understand the incentives question and the data question.
I think we need to see the small business advocates or the OSDBUs or what have you as part of the acquisition workforce in a way that we don't see them. So we talk a lot about cross-functional training and acquisition. You should be learning contracting and logistics and all these different pieces so you really understand the customer and so forth. If you look at most of the small business folks, this is definitely true at DoD, and I think it's true of most of the agencies, they are small business people. That's what they do. And you get so into your own little narrow space that you tend not to see the broader sector and the impacts more broadly. So I think the more you can integrate the small business community into broader acquisition training, broader industrial and commercial understanding, the better it'll be. And sadly, one of the smartest small business advocates at DoD passed away last year, but she was one of the few who really seemed to get kind of the big picture, right, and understand kind of all these different pieces. And so I think it's great if the training, particularly if it can be integrated into the broader acquisition.
And Stan, we're doing just that.
Good, good.
New career field is 1101, okay? It's designed to get more than contracting people in the career field, program managers, logisticians, those types of things. So that's exactly what we're doing.
Great.
We have training right now that is required for certification that's in logistics certification training, which is in program management certification training, as well as contracting. Contracting's always been that way, but so we're moving in that direction.
The one thing I do want to add, critical to that, is the changing the culture of the thought, of how people think. The current thought process is, I've got to meet my goals.
Yes.
And I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's a
What's
very,
the
very
real
narrow
objective?
perspective, as opposed to thinking of, what can I do to make this business be successful and grow? And that requires a change in culture and thought and incentives.
And that's a great point. If I could just add one thing to that, Jack, I'm sorry.
Sure.
A couple of years ago, we did a study for the Department of Homeland Security at the Secretary's request to look at their small business program because they were getting beat up on the Hill constantly. Yet they were one of the few agencies that were exceeding their goals, and they couldn't figure out why we were getting beat up so bad. So we went out and we talked to all the components and so forth. And one of the things we found there is exactly what we find across acquisition generally, which is this incredible disconnect between the customer and everybody else. So I've got a customer over here who has a need. I've got a buyer over here who's doing the buying. And in the case of a small, then I've got an OSDBU over here. They're not aligned around the same incentives. They don't communicate and collaborate very well. So we talk a lot about industry-government collaboration. The internal collaboration isn't there. And that was clearly a problem across a number of the components of DHS. They were not collaborating very well. So you get to a point where you ask a PEO in the Air Force, why are you doing this? We've been told by the policy folks we have to do it. And the customer folks, well, as long as people are just badge flipping, it's okay with me. Well, badge flipping isn't achieving anything. You know what I mean? So there's a lack of collaboration and communication, even internal to the government, let alone externally. And I think the small business piece is part of that we don't even think of it that way sometimes.
Well, that's why your training is so critical, because we have so many people now across the federal government. Only 50% of the acquisition workforce have less than have anything. Most of them, 50%, have less than 5 years of experience, and this training is critical to those. What we did was we had other than the people in this room, we have an aging workforce, and that's a problem. But as these people have been retiring, we've been replacing them with interns, and that's why the training is so critical. They've got to gain experience and training. Yeah.
Tom Lampley with KBR. My comment to the panel, I have a comment and a suggestion, I guess. And my comment goes to remarks that Dr. Gansler made in his introduction about the purposes of the small business program to begin with, one of which was to protect the industrial base. So my concern is associated with the purpose of the study, too, of the unintended consequences associated with taking so much of the base operations support work that is now being done in the United States, setting it aside for small business, that we're eroding the industrial base by not allowing more of the larger business opportunities to maintain a warm base back here in the continental United States so that there is somebody that can go forward in a big way, as we've done in this past war. And we are eroding that capability very rapidly. And I don't know that enough attention is being placed on protecting that industrial services base. And so that was my comment. My suggestion is that maybe there ought to be some requirement to set aside some of the larger base operations support contracts, make sure that they set aside a certain percentage of those so that for full and open, and not limit it just to small businesses, because that unintended consequences, what's driving that into Mr. Halleck's comment about what's happening with the Eagle program. When we talk about the unintended consequences there, I don't know there was a conscious decision on the part of the Army to set this aside to small business, more driven by they were forced to do that primarily because they had too many small businesses that could demonstrate they could do that. So that entire part of the industrial base has now pretty much been set aside for small business. So all these unintended consequences really add up to become a problem for us for future national security in terms of responding to the next big war. So I'd like to hear the panel's comments on how we might avoid that problem.
Well, there's actually been some data gathered on in terms of contractor support on the battlefield, which I did a Defense Science Board study of this a few years ago. I was surprised to find that in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had more contractors than we had people in uniform. And that's the point you're making, that we really need to recognize that. And therefore, we want people with experience. That doesn't mean whether they're small or large, but we want people with, that's where past performance comes in again. Okay, you want to make a comment?
Tom, you want to comment? I'll just say, I think that's part of my point about, this starts with including this in your strategic acquisition thinking up front about, we don't do industrial base analyses typically around services contracts. That's where it starts.
So it's slipping away is the problem, and nobody is focused on that. It'll come to light later in the future when they're called upon.
Well, and more than 60% of our dollars go to services today in the Defense Department, I know. Did a study on that some time ago, too.
Well, I would say, and I haven't thought through carefully enough to endorse Stan's recommendation, but his point about maybe having a separate goal for services, a lot of this behavior is driven by the fact that there's one monolithic goal, and services are the easiest place to kind of get, to move the needle if you're a service. And I want to point out that the Army has always met its goals, and so Harry's off the hook. But
was Tracy Pinson, it wasn't
but for the folks who are scrambling to achieve a goal that they find very challenging to achieve, there is this incredible incentive to find something that is very amenable to small business contracting and shovel the whole thing into that realm. And so I do think, I'm not ready to endorse the suggestion, but I just point out that what Stan is suggesting would, I think, have a real impact on that kind of situation.
Well, let's see. Dawn said we could take another 5 minutes, but if you want to make any final comments, any one of the three of you?
I'll make some final comments. I'll go back to the first statement I said. Being an entrepreneur in the greatest nation on the earth is a great feeling. Small businesses play an extremely critical role in our economy. What the challenge is once you get out of that small business. And some companies want to stay small, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a lifestyle company. But for those who want to get out of that small business and build a business and a sustainable business, the rules and regulations and the incentives make it challenging to continue to grow and sustain it. And I think that we need to look at some of those and find better ways to put in the right metrics on how many businesses we build and sustain over the life of the company.
Stan, did you want to say anything?
I think we said it all.
Okay. And you going to straighten out the Congress?
Well, I'll just reiterate, I do think the opportunity is there. I think it's really a challenge to get these kinds of issues addressed in a constructive way in Congress. Of course, these days it's a challenge to get much of anything addressed in a constructive way in Congress, and I don't mean that in any partisan way. It's just a challenge.
535 small businesses.
Exactly.
They're each interested in their own objective.
All true. But I do think that, at the level of principle and policy, there is, these policies are not that, at the level of, promoting jobs, promoting small business opportunities. I think there is consensus around those objectives. And I think to the extent that you can really tie the statutes and the policies back to that level, you can make progress. And so my hope is that will occur over the next 2 years.
Again, let me ask if any of you have any thoughts, please send them in to us on innovation and incentives and the data and the rewards, all of the things that came up during this discussion. Okay, well, again, let me thank all of you for coming today, and I think it was worthwhile.